Hello, students. This is part two of the 1920s and 1930s. It's a continuation of the cultural changes that happened in the early 20th century. This slide talks about the Harlem Renaissance, what happened between 1920s and the 1930s. So after World War One into the Great Depression. The leaders of the Harlem Renaissance drew upon the heritage of African American culture to establish themselves as a powerful force for cultural change in art, music, literature, politics, dance, radio, education. And it's important to understand that the Great Migration helped spur the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and 1930s. Langston Hughes and Bessie Smith and Ella Fitzgerald, Jacob Lawrence, Count Basie, a lot of important people. And one thing I want to point out is that African Americans during this time didn't want to have people just focus on the fact that African Americans had a history of being slaves and facing segregation and racism and discrimination, and that they had no important history in America. That's not true, because African Americans played a role in influencing the music that you listen to today. A lot of hip hop, country, rock and roll, and jazz. So they wanted to put that on display during the Harlem Renaissance. And it says the Harlem Renaissance was a period of rebirth in African American culture during the 1920s and 1930s. Many black artists, musicians, and writers influenced this movement. This movement inspired and gave African Americans pride in their past, their heritage, their culture. Harlem is a predominantly black community in New York City. And you've heard of the Harlem Globetrotters, which is a basketball team that does a lot of fun, neat stunts on the basketball court around the world. And they got the name Harlem Globetrotters because, number one, they travel around the world. And number two is they wanted people to know that they were black. And the Harlem Globetrotters got their start in Chicago, which is not in New York City. So I wanted to point that out. And you had some important leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, who were the driving force of this rebirth in black culture and drive for black equality. The important people that I'm going to talk to you about first is Duke Ellington. Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington was an American composer. Someone who writes music. He was a pianist. He tore piano up. He was awesome. And he was a band leader of jazz orchestras. And Bessie Smith performed with him in his jazz orchestra. Even though she was mostly known as a blues singer, she also performed jazz. He led his orchestra from 1923 until his death. And his career spanned 50 years. And it's important to understand he was an important musician. He was a great singer who had nonsense syllables in his music that was fun to listen to and cool. Heebie-jeebie-jeebie-jee, stuff like that. It's really cool for people to listen to. And he played the piano during the song, Take the A Train. So, very instrumental musician that influenced the Harlem Renaissance. Artist that was very well known during the Harlem Renaissance, Jacob Lawrence. He kind of looks like me. Might be my twin brother. I don't have a twin brother. Anyway, Jacob Lawrence was an African American painter known for his portrayal of African American life. Lawrence referred to his style as dynamic cubism. Jacob Lawrence, a painter who chronicled the experience of the Great Migration through art, modern art, and Harlem Renaissance. Chronicle means different stages in a time frame. Like you put stuff in chronological order. Here's an example of Jacob Lawrence's artwork. And it kind of makes me think about Harriet Tubman during the Underground Railroad. That comes to my mind. Even though the Underground Railroad happened before the Great Migration, It may be somebody who is up to no good, that's impacting this family, and this woman has a pistol, and she's shooing him away or telling him to get out, leave our family alone, something like that, that regard. So you can interpret it any way you want to. Here's a picture of the Great Migration of African Americans north. It's indicated by the birds in the background. They're flying north. And it's also indicated by the belongings and luggage that African Americans are carrying. Remember that there were push and pull factors that made African Americans migrate to the north and Midwest and out west in our country's history. So this is by Jacob Lawrence, chronicling the scenes of the Great Migration through art. Another important person that influenced the Harlem Renaissance period was a man named Langston Hughes, and he was born in Joplin, Missouri. He's in the area of literature, and he was a great poet. James Mercer Langston Hughes was an American poet, social activist, novelist, playwright, and a columnist. So what that means, a columnist is somebody who writes an article in a newspaper that gives their opinion about an issue in society they want people to be concerned about. He was one of the earliest innovators of the then new literary art form called jazz poetry. Langston Hughes was a poet who combined the experience of African and American cultural roots. Singing, dance, everyday life of being black in America, being proud to be black, people working in the factory, people working in the steel mill, people dealing with racism, people dealing with the KKK, people dealing with losing their job, people who had all these hopes and dreams of things are going to be better, and they didn't happen. So, very influential writer, poet. Here's a poem by Langston Hughes. It's called Harlem, and it says, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore, and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" So dream deferred means you have all these dreams of equality and better economic opportunity, not dealing with social problems and racism, discrimination, then it flies in your face that it doesn't happen. So that's what Langston Hughes wrote about. He wrote about injustice, and he also wrote about the hope that racism, discrimination, and segregation will go away for African Americans. Here's Louis Armstrong, known as Satchmo. Louis Armstrong was a trumpeter, band leader, singer, soloist, film star, and comedian, considered one of the most influential artists in jazz history. And he's known for Stardust, La Vie en Rose, and Oh, What a Wonderful World. And you've heard that before. And he was known as Satchmo. He grew up poor in New Orleans, and he traveled up north. And he took care of he helped provide for his family when he was a little boy. And that's really important to know. So he had resilience to overcome poverty and racism and strife. An important jazz singer during the Harlem Renaissance. And there's a trumpet. You've seen a trumpet before. Here's another important African American that influenced the Harlem Renaissance in the area of music, particularly jazz, mostly blues. Her name is Bessie Smith. Best way to remember her is Bessie Blues. You know the alliteration there. Jazz and blues vocalist, which means a singer. Bessie Smith's powerful, soulful voice won her countless fans and earned her the title Empress of the Blues. Richest African American woman of her time, and she performed with Louis Armstrong, and she died young. And blues is a type of music style and genre where there's a lot of sad and despair and loss of love and loss of opportunity. And blues today is still sung, but it's also blended with jazz and rock and roll in the form of R&B. And you should know what R&B is. So that's very, very instrumental in our culture today. So this is a wrap of the Harlem Renaissance, important writers and musicians and artists of the 1920s and 1930s. And feel free to go back and listen to this presentation again to help you understand it better. And you have to answer some Edpuzzle questions. Thank you for listening, and get ready for part 3. Peace.